There were models of media and academia working together before, not so many examples, but back in the 60s there was a case related to riots in Detroit where academia and the media cooperated. Later on, closer to us, some 10 years ago, I was part of an experiment where several universities in the UK and The Guardian, which is an important newspaper in the UK, worked together on an investigation. The impact that these examples of cooperation produced was, I would say, the main source of inspiration for this model of putting together media and academics to cooperate.
It went with us working out what we were doing as we went along. Basically, I wouldn't say making it up as we went along. We were thinking about it. We had an earlier meeting when we sort of laid out how we thought things would work, but of course things work quite differently when it actually comes to reality. When it came for the particular cases, it usually meant that the researcher would start on the ground earlier than the journalist in both cases. So the journalists were involved in the original background research, the wider sort of political questions, but the first people to go to the two settlements where we did the research were the anthropologists or sociologists in both cases. This was probably because we need more time. I myself am an anthropologist, and so we just basically spend more time doing the research than the journalists on the ground, but also because in both cases there was a large distrust towards journalists for various reasons, and we don't have that baggage as social scientists. So it meant that we could go there first, we could spend time doing research in the village, we could spend time getting to know people, spend time building trust, which is also very important. And then once this has been established, then we can also then start to involve the journalists. We could start then to involve the journalist in the research, actually face to face with people in these settlements.
On the negative side, there were problems between the pace of work between journalists and academics, because researchers in the academia and universities take more time to do their work. Anthropologists take years sometimes to publish their work, while journalists need the investigation. They need to finish it as soon as possible and make their findings available to the public.
The researchers would want to spend a lot more time gathering data and working through it. And the journalists were much more like, okay, there's somewhere we need to get to, let's get there, whilst, and this even could be felt right down into an interview. So when we did an interview together, myself and the journalist from Atlatszo, Dragomir, I noticed, I started asking some questions and then she continued, and this is how we'd agreed we would do it before, and just the different style of doing interviews was very noticeable. So for anthropologists, we don't want to put too much researcher bias, in any situation, or we don't necessarily want to lead people in a certain direction. Not that this is not what I'm saying the journalists did, but so we would sort of ask around a question and allow the person to sort of slowly unfold their ideas in conversation with us, and then we would slowly circle back round to certain ideas and so on. But with the journalist, it was more like, okay, this is the thing we need to find out. Let's find it out. Boom, 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 boom. So there was even a different tempo within the interview itself. So these different tempos were taking place in the interviews. They were taking place in the wider idea of how long we would spend doing the research and those sort of wider timeframes, and then even when it came to publishing as well. So this was both something which was a source of tension and difficulty to try and match these two different timeframes. But at the same time, I think it was actually the best thing that came out of the project in the end, because it was beneficial for both of us to constantly be questioning our practices.
There were also not problems, but a lack of coordination between researchers and journalists when it comes to the way they look at ethics. This is different for the two groups.
So it meant that very often when we were actually doing the research together, the way we were having the discussions was that, we as the social scientists were often thinking about, I guess, like social structures and these sorts of questions, whereas the journalists, but not really thinking already about the final output, but from the minute the journalist was there with their feet on the ground in the settlement, they were thinking about what the final output would be. And so this was a tension, but I think a very healthy tension as we went back and forth between each other, asking why we were doing stuff, and then changing as we went along.
On the more positive side, I think it's extremely, the biggest takeaway was that working, putting together journalists and researchers to cooperate leads to more in-depth, improved stories, because researchers have the time to provide a lot of material to journalists. At the same time, they can lead to a number of formats in which the content is delivered, because the work of researchers also helps journalists. And at the same time, journalists have access to sources and to information they wouldn't have access without researchers, because in some countries, in some cases, people and institutions tend to speak more freely with the researchers if they know that these results are for science than with journalists. I think, in fact, these days with journalism going through a lot of crises, but including the most important crisis, which is the financial crisis. Also, the time when journalism is suffering a lot because of the pandemic, that is leading to losses of jobs and a renewed financial crisis in the field. But at the same time, because academia is being attacked more and more by populists, by governments, because it's a space of free thinking, I think the two fields have a lot to share. I think, in fact, that this is probably one of the key models that would help both journalism and academia in the future. So I think people in both fields should seriously think about that. But for that to work, it needs a lot of things. First of all, it needs scale. Our modest experiment will not solve all the problems. More universities, more media outlets should embark on this model. It needs more articulation. It needs more consistency. So it has to be done in a more, let's say, institutionalized way, with both parties being very serious about sharing resources and time to lead to these results.
Well, it certainly doesn't produce material as fast as other forms of journalism might, but I think what you get is a much richer, deeper and more varied output because of that. And this was really done in a pilot sense. There was only a few of us working in the project. If it was scaled up onto a bigger level, there were bigger teams of people working on a certain story, and we worked out more precisely stages along the way, which we couldn't really do because we were working out how this cooperation would work from the very beginning. Then I could imagine that this could be a model that could be implemented in many different settings and on many different types of stories.